Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So here's something a little bit different for you guys. We're looking today at the Atlantean Sword featured in Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer. And you can thank the Patreon supporters of my channel for this suggestion for this type of video, where the idea came from there, to look at movie swords and sort of say what I think about them. So this was the first one that came to mind. As a kid, well, even now, big fan of the original Conan films. I've got to say, I'm not a big fan of the most recent one, but Conan the Barbarian in particular, I think is actually a genuinely good film. And, you know, I have lots of negative things that I could say about the arms and armour and equipment and everything else in that film, but I'm not gonna, because it's a good film, and, you know, by the standards of lots of other fantasy films out there, a lot of the equipment used is actually kind of fine. Within a fantasy setting, they've kind of stuck to some historical precedents and some sort of, you know, sensible ideas of how big certain types of weapons should be and certain shapes of weapons. Yeah, they've got some oversized axes that were very clearly made of aluminium, because if they were made of steel they would weigh as much as a 14-pound sledgehammer, and there's some, you know, giant wooden mallets and some very silly things in there, but it kind of looks right, and it also kind of fits in with that comic kind of 1970s 1980s kind of comic fantasy art genre. So looking at the sword, the Atlantean Sword, you know, we all know, all of us who've watched the film know that Conan discovered it in a tomb in the hand or under the hand of a dead skeletal king, and he strangely sort of cracked the rust off the blade, the corrosion off the blade. Don't know how that works. Well, I can assure you it doesn't work like that, but let's just say it's some special type of steel, and the corrosion, dirt, whatever it is, built up on the surface but somehow didn't actually corrode the blade. Pretty cool steel. I wish I could get some of that myself. It's also worth mentioning that the sword featured in Conan the Barbarian is not exactly the same as the sword in Conan the Destroyer. They are essentially supposed to be the same sword. They are the Atlantean Sword, and the design is essentially the same, maybe with a few little differences, such as the grip wrap. But they are slightly differently sized. The Conan the Destroyer sword, they decided to make it slightly longer. It's got a 1 inch longer blade, it's got a 1 inch longer hilt, and I believe it's even slightly wider as well, so they just generally scaled it up a bit. Maybe looking back at the Conan the Barbarian film, the first film, maybe they thought that the sword looked a bit undersized compared to Arnie himself, and I'd agree with that. But I'll talk a little bit more about the size of the weapon in a minute. The sword itself was designed and built by Jody Sampson, legendary knife and sword maker of that period. And in modern times, if you want to get a replica of it, there are lots of really shitty stainless steel replicas out there, but if you want to get a good replica of it, you need really to go to Albion swords. First off, in terms of describing what it actually is, well, in loosest terms, it is a bastard sword. It's a hand and a half sword. It's a sword that can be used in one hand or two. It's not a giant two-handed sword. It's not what we call a great sword or a Zweihander or a Spadone or something like that. It is a hand and a half sword. However, the thing which has always struck me about the sword, and this is the bit where my constructive criticism comes in, the thing that I think that they got wrong about it, is it's really short. I think it's just too short. And, you know, they increased the length slightly for Conan the Destroyer, but I would still say they didn't increase it enough. However, I kind of think I know why they didn't, and that is because Jody Sampson's swords seem to have all been really, really heavy. Now, you know, Arnie's a big guy, we accept that, but doesn't matter how kind of big and built you are, there is a certain kind of nonsensical logic to building a sword that only has a 27-inch blade and yet weighs in the region of 6 pounds. If we put that into context, the average Spadone, or Zweihander, whatever you want to call it, that maybe comes up to about an average person's chin or face height, it also weighs about 6 pounds, 6-7 pounds. So this sword, which only has a 27-inch blade, which is shorter than most one-handed swords, or certainly shorter than a lot of one-handed swords, it only has a 27-inch blade, and yet it weighs the same as a massive two-handed sword. So it doesn't matter how strong a person is, if in a kind of trade-off and efficiency, if you have 6 pounds of steel or 6.5 pounds of steel, it's far better making that blade into a shape that's far longer. or making it, if you want a very heavy percussive weapon, making it into a mace or a warhammer or an axe or something like this. So the thing that's always bothered me about this sword is the fact that it is essentially way too heavy or way too short, depending how you look at it. Just to give you some stats, the blade is 27 on the original sword, on the Conan the Barbarian sword, it's 27-inch blade. And the ricasso, if we call it that, so it's the area where you have the extensions coming up from the hilt, where you can actually grip the base of the blade, they are 6.5 inches long themselves. So that leaves us only a functional blade of 21 inches, 20 to 21 inches. That is short. That's as short as a kind of Roman gladius or other types of short sword, essentially. So what we've got here is essentially something that's the size and shape, in silhouette at least, of a bastard sword, but the functional blade of it is only the length of a short sword. So it's a pretty strange thing. So as I've said, it's very heavy for its size. Arnie was a big guy, but my opinion is that it would have been a better sword, both visually on screen and indeed as an actual weapon, if the blade had been made lighter and longer. It could have been made slightly narrower, it could have been made with probably better distal taper or not as thick. Obviously I haven't seen the original sword, so I don't know what the exact problems with the movie sword was, but in terms of the replicas, they tend to be too thick and have no distal taper, and of course they've got no profile taper either. They're as broad at the tip as they, or just before the tip, as they are at the base of the blade. The sword, nevertheless, in my view, is an attractive looking sword. It looks like a convincing fantasy sword, and I think it's almost without doubt the most, or at least one of the most, iconic fantasy weapons ever designed. And even to this day, it looks pretty badass, I think. If you don't know the weight of it, then, you know, if this was, say, a 3.5 pound sword, yeah, it'd be a pretty good bastard sword. It would be a bit short, but, you know, using it as a bastard sword in close quarters, maybe in conjunction with a shield a lot of the times, yeah, if this was a lighter sword, if it was a sensible weight for its size, I think it would be a pretty decent weapon. And, you know, a lot of people complain about those languettes, or whatever you want to call them, coming up the base of the blade on the ricasso. I don't have a problem with that. It's emulating what we see on Zweihanders, where you have a blunt portion of the blade at the base of the blade, so you can use the sword in a sort of half-swording technique. And really, in most swordsmanship, the base of the blade is only usually used defensively anyway, so the fact that the edges are covered and it's blunt doesn't matter. It's really only the end of the blade, the middle of the blade and the end of the blade, that you want to be edged and sharp, even on a standard sword. So there we go, folks. I hope that was interesting. I do love Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Destroyer less so, and the most recent version of Conan even less. But I do love the original film, and I do think this is a massively iconic fantasy sword. I could make it better, but hey ho, nothing's perfect. And remember, kids, remember what's best in life. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.